In the scorching deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, a man of immense power in Rome met a horrifying end. A death so shocking it left a lasting scar on the empire for generations. This was Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest individual, who had built his vast fortune through the suffering of others. He would tragically learn that unchecked desire, when pushed to its extreme, becomes a force of self-destruction. This account details how gold, the very source of his formidable influence, ultimately became the instrument of his most gruesome demise. The year was 53 BCE, and Rome's insatiable drive for conquest had reached an intense peak. Three dominant figures held sway over the known world through a delicate alliance: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his partners forged their legendary reputations through brilliant military campaigns, Crassus confronted a humbling reality. He was widely perceived as nothing more than a financier among true warriors. His colossal wealth, amassed through aggressive real estate speculation and the brutal exploitation of slave labor, secured him significant political influence, but utterly failed to win him the deep respect he so desperately yearned for. Crassus had keenly observed Caesar's stunning victories in Gaul and Pompey's commanding control of the Mediterranean Sea, their triumphs echoing resoundingly through Rome's magnificent marble halls, while his own accomplishments were merely measured in monetary terms. The constant sting of being labeled the third wheel of the powerful triumvirate gnawed at him incessantly. At 60 years old, an age when most men would have been content to simply enjoy their accumulated riches, Crassus perceived only one path to achieving true, lasting glory: a military conquest grand enough to stand proudly alongside or even surpass those of his more celebrated allies. The Parthian Empire beckoned to him, appearing like an irresistible golden treasure lying beyond Rome's eastern frontier, stretching majestically from the Euphrates River all the way to the Indus. This immense kingdom held command over the incredibly lucrative silk and spice routes, vital arteries that connected the vast networks of the East and West. Crassus thoroughly convinced himself that conquering Parthia would not only secure unparalleled military glory, but also yield unimaginable wealth. Enough gold and silver to make even his already staggering fortune seem modest in comparison. The Roman Senate, deeply suspicious of his ambitious motives, explicitly refused to grant him the traditional formal declaration of war. Yet, Crassus, undeterred by their opposition, pressed forward with his plans regardless. In 55 BCE, Crassus arrived in Syria, assuming his role as governor, and immediately began comprehensive preparations for his colossal invasion. He chose to entirely disregard the earnest warnings of local commanders who possessed a profound understanding of Parthian military tactics, arrogantly dismissing their grave concerns as mere cowardice. He reasoned that the desert kingdoms had always eventually succumbed to superior Roman discipline and engineering. So why should the formidable Parthia prove to be any different? His confidence was significantly bolstered by intelligence reports suggesting considerable internal strife and discord within the Parthian royal court, making them appear particularly vulnerable to a swift and decisive Roman strike. Crassus meticulously assembled a truly massive force: 7 legions, totaling nearly 40,000 seasoned men, powerfully supported by 4,000 formidable cavalry units and an equal number of highly effective light infantry. This assembled army represented one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever put together for a campaign of eastern conquest. Among his high-ranking officers was his beloved son, Publius, a proven and courageous warrior who had already served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul. The esteemed presence of his heir gave Crassus additional personal motivation. This ambitious campaign, he believed, would unequivocally establish a lasting dynasty of military glory for his family name. The grand invasion commenced in the spring of 53 BCE, with the Roman forces majestically crossing the Euphrates River at Zeugma. Initial progress seemed to fully validate Crassus's unshakable confidence. Local settlements. Facing the overwhelming Roman might, either surrendered immediately without resistance or fell swiftly to superior Roman siegecraft. The expansive, flat Mesopotamian terrain appeared ideally suited for the highly effective tactics of Roman heavy infantry, and early intelligence suggested that King Orodes II of Parthia was significantly distracted by internal rebellions, consequently leaving the frontier relatively lightly defended. However, Crassus's initial string of successes was, in reality, a meticulously planned part of a carefully orchestrated Parthian strategy. General Surena, the remarkably young but exceptionally cunning commander of the Parthian forces, was deliberately luring the Romans deeper and deeper into the vast desert, drawing them dangerously far from their vital supply lines and into terrain that overwhelmingly favored Parthian cavalry over the slower, less mobile Roman infantry. The few minor skirmishes that did occur were not genuine battles, but expertly executed tactical retreats, precisely designed to give Crassus a false sense of security and overconfidence, while simultaneously exhausting his army through brutal forced marches under the merciless, scorching heat. As the Roman army pushed relentlessly deeper into the heart of the Mesopotamian desert, the true, formidable nature of their elusive enemy began to slowly reveal itself. The Parthians were emphatically not the disorganized barbarians that Roman propaganda had so confidently portrayed. Instead, they were a highly sophisticated military power with centuries of invaluable experience fighting effectively in the harsh, unforgiving conditions of their homeland. Their entire army was masterfully built around principles of extreme mobility and devastating ranged combat. Formidable heavy cavalry units, known as cataphracts, used for powerful shock attacks, and incredibly agile lighter horse archers who could strike from seemingly impossible distances while consistently remaining well beyond the reach of Roman retaliation. Surena's brilliant strategy ruthlessly exploited every single weakness inherent in established Roman military doctrine. Where Romans rigidly relied on close formation fighting and superior engineering, Parthians vehemently emphasized unmatched speed and fluid flexibility. Where Romans confidently expected large, set-piece battles with clear, decisive objectives, Parthians cunningly preferred constant harassment and a slow, draining attrition. Most critically, where Romans mistakenly assumed their enemies would eventually engage in direct, decisive combat, Parthians were perfectly content to avoid direct confrontation, instead slowly bleeding their opponents dry through relentless, constant skirmishing. The psychological warfare employed by the Parthians was equally sophisticated and devastating. Parthian scouts would suddenly appear on distant ridges, just visible enough to keep Roman soldiers perpetually on edge and filled with apprehension, then vanish completely before any organized pursuit could even be considered. Supply convoys came under devastating attack from seemingly invisible enemies who struck without any warning and then disappeared instantly back into the vast, featureless expanse of the desert. Sleep became an unattainable luxury. The sentries constantly reported strange sounds and movements throughout the long, dark nights, leaving the entire Roman army utterly exhausted and consumed by paranoia. Crassus slowly began to grasp the stark reality that traditional Roman tactics were proving woefully inadequate against this terrifying new type of fluid, elusive warfare. His heavy infantry, considered invincible in the dense European forests or on the familiar Mediterranean coastal plains, struggled immensely with the oppressive heat, the unfamiliar terrain, and the unconventional, baffling enemy tactics. The cavalry forces he had managed to assemble were completely insufficient for the highly mobile warfare that so utterly dominated the region, and his vital supply lines were becoming increasingly vulnerable to relentless Parthian raids that seemed to come from literally everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The critical turning point arrived at Carrhae, a relatively small city situated in northern Mesopotamia, where Crassus, with a desperate hope, decided to make his final stand. The local geography appeared, at first glance, to favor his chosen position. Surrounding hills provided excellent defensive ground for his infantry, while the presence of a natural water source would immediately solve his pressing supply problems. Intelligence reports suggested that Surena's main force was indeed approaching, promising the very decisive battle that Crassus believed would vindicate his entire disastrous campaign and unequivocally demonstrate Roman superiority once and for all. The Battle of Carrhae began precisely at dawn on June 9th, 53 BCE, with Roman forces meticulously arranged in their traditional, well-established formation. Heavy infantry solidly in the center, cavalry positioned effectively on the wings, and light troops diligently screening the main force. Crassus himself positioned within the central formation, while his brave son Publius commanded the right-wing cavalry. The formation presented an impressive sight in the early morning light. Standards gleaming proudly and armor polished to a shine, representing what was then considered the finest military machine the ancient world had ever witnessed. Surena's approach, however, instantly revealed the true brilliance and innovative nature of Parthian military science. Instead of a conventional, traditional army formation, the Romans were confronted by something entirely unprecedented. A purely cavalry force that moved with a terrifying, unified precision, like a single, monstrous organism across the vast desert floor. The Parthian heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe in gleaming metal scales, formed the formidable center, while thousands of highly mobile horse archers flowed around them like water, creating a constantly shifting tactical situation that Roman commanders found utterly impossible to predict or counter effectively. The battle commenced with a massive, overwhelming Parthian arrow barrage that literally darkened the sky above the Roman formation. Unlike previous enemies who would typically exhaust their ammunition quickly, the Parthians had meticulously organized efficient supply trains of fresh arrows that kept their relentless archers constantly resupplied, maintaining an unbroken torrent of missiles. Roman shields, specifically designed to stop spears and swords in close combat, proved tragically inadequate against the sustained, devastating missile bombardment that continued hour after hour without any respite, gradually and relentlessly wearing down Roman morale and effectiveness. Publius Crassus, young and intensely eager to prove his worth, made the fatal and impulsive decision to break formation and impulsively charge the Parthian center with his cavalry wing. This reckless move played directly into Surena's cunning strategy. The heavy cataphracts absorbed the Roman charge with unwavering resilience, while the agile horse archers swiftly surrounded the exposed Roman cavalry force. Cut off completely from the main Roman army and encircled by enemies who struck with deadly accuracy from all directions, Publius's force was systematically and brutally destroyed in full view of his horrified father and the stunned remainder of the Roman army. The tragic death of Publius marked the devastating psychological turning point of the entire battle. Surena's men brutally severed the young man's head and mounted it triumphantly on a spear, parading it cruelly before the Roman battle line while his father watched in stunned, agonizing horror. The ghastly sight of his son's head bobbing above the enemy ranks utterly shattered whatever composure Crassus had desperately tried to maintain throughout the grueling campaign. The once confident general who had so boldly crossed the Euphrates months earlier was now replaced by a broken, grief-stricken old man who could barely issue coherent orders. Roman discipline began to tragically collapse as the horrifying reality of their desperate situation became chillingly clear. They were hopelessly trapped in hostile territory, completely surrounded by an enemy who could strike at will while consistently remaining beyond any hope of retaliation. Water supplies were critically low. The dead and wounded were accumulating at an alarming rate, faster than they could possibly be treated. And every futile attempt to break out of the encirclement resulted in even heavier, demoralizing casualties. The vast desert that had once seemed like an open highway to glorious conquest had now become an inescapable prison with no visible escape route. As night descended, Crassus desperately attempted to organize a retreat toward the nearby city of Carrhae, clinging to the hope that urban terrain would negate the overwhelming advantages of the Parthian cavalry. However, The planned withdrawal quickly devolved into a chaotic rout as exhausted Roman soldiers abandoned their heavy equipment and crucial discipline in a frantic, desperate attempt to reach safety. Thousands were brutally cut down during the chaotic night march, while countless others simply collapsed from utter exhaustion and severe heat stroke, mercilessly left behind by comrades who could barely save themselves. The shattered remnants of Rome's once great Eastern army stumbled into Carrhae as dawn broke, having lost nearly half their strength in a single, devastating day of combat. The proud legions that had so confidently crossed the Euphrates were now reduced to a desperate, demoralized mob of survivors. Their cherished standards lost, their collective confidence utterly shattered, and their commander broken by profound grief and the crushing magnitude of his failure. Crassus had indeed achieved the decisive battle he so desperately wanted. But the outcome had gone entirely and tragically against him. Serena, with a tactical brilliance that transcended immediate military advantage, rather than pressing his advantage with an immediate, overwhelming assault on the city, chose instead to demonstrate a surprising act of Parthian magnanimity by offering negotiations. He dispatched envoys under clear flags of truce, proposing a meeting between the opposing commanders to discuss terms for a Roman withdrawal. The offer appeared outwardly reasonable. Both sides had undoubtedly suffered casualties, and the Parthians had conclusively proven their decisive point regarding Roman vulnerability. For Crassus, who was utterly desperate to salvage anything at all from the colossal disaster, the proposal offered a glimmer of hope for saving at least some of his remaining men. The meeting was meticulously arranged to take place on neutral ground situated between the two armies, with both commanders accompanied only by small retinues of trusted officers. Crassus, despite receiving grave warnings from several subordinates who strongly suspected treachery, agreed to the parley. His overwhelming desperation to finally end the agonizing nightmare tragically overrode his usual astute tactical judgment. He desperately needed to believe that some honorable solution was still possible, that his monumental gamble hadn't culminated in complete catastrophe for Rome and irreversible personal ruin for himself. What transpired next remains a subject of intense dispute among ancient historians. But the final outcome was undeniably clear. The meeting violently erupted into chaos, with Parthian soldiers swiftly overpowering the Roman delegation. Whether this was a premeditated act of treachery or the tragic result of profound misunderstandings and escalating mutual suspicions, Crassus found himself a helpless prisoner of the very man who had utterly destroyed his army and ruthlessly killed his beloved son. The richest man in Rome was now completely at the mercy of enemies who had every legitimate reason to despise everything he represented. Serena's treatment of his captive vividly demonstrated the profound depth of Parthian anger and resentment toward Roman imperial ambitions. This was not merely a defeated general to be quickly ransomed or summarily executed. Crassus embodied everything the Parthians utterly despised about Rome's relentless expansion. His invasion had been an utterly unprovoked act of aggression, motivated purely by insatiable greed and boundless ambition, launched without any regard for Parthian sovereignty or the countless lives that would inevitably be lost in his relentless pursuit of personal glory. The deliberate decision to execute Crassus in a manner that perfectly befitted his character and alleged crimes reflected both Parthian concepts of justice and their sophisticated understanding of symbolic messaging. In a culture that profoundly valued honor and meticulously measured character by actions rather than by accumulated wealth, Crassus epitomized everything contemptible about Roman values. His death needed to deliver a powerful, unequivocal message, not merely to Rome itself, but to any future invaders who might mistakenly perceive Parthian territories as easy conquests. The method chosen for his execution was both brutally practical and profoundly symbolic: molten gold. The very metal that had meticulously defined Crassus's entire life and had singularly motivated his disastrous invasion would become the literal instrument of his excruciating death. Parthian craftsmen painstakingly heated gold until it achieved a liquid, incandescent form, creating a substance that would mercilessly burn through human tissue while simultaneously carrying a deep, chilling symbolic meaning. The man who had worshipped gold above all else, who had made it his ultimate deity, would now experience its true, terrifying nature. Beautiful and alluring in its solid form, but lethally destructive in its liquid state. Precious and coveted, yet ultimately the direct cause of his undoing. The execution was carried out before a solemn audience of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, making it both a judicial proceeding and a stark, public demonstration of Parthian might and retribution. Crassus was forcibly brought to his knees, while Parthian soldiers brutally held his mouth open, cruelly preventing any desperate last words or pleas for mercy. The molten gold was poured slowly, deliberately, ensuring maximum agonizing suffering while simultaneously creating a ghastly spectacle that would be vividly remembered and intensely discussed for generations throughout the entire ancient world. The physical agony inflicted was truly unimaginable. Liquid gold at temperatures exceeding 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit, burning relentlessly through his mouth, throat, and vital internal organs, all while Crassus remained agonizingly conscious. But the symbolic message was equally, if not more, important. The man who had valued gold above human life, who had built his immense fortune through ruthless exploitation and brutal violence, was now experiencing gold's true nature as an overwhelmingly destructive force. His obsessive worship of wealth had quite literally become his own damnation. Witnesses described Crassus's final moments as a grotesque and horrifying parody of his life's most ambitious pursuits. The very mouth that had so confidently spoken of grand conquest and unparalleled glory was now being filled with the very metal he had so ruthlessly pursued across continents. The throat that had eloquently delivered inspiring speeches about Rome's inevitable destiny was now burned beyond any recognition. The body that had luxuriated in unimaginable comfort and opulence was now being grotesquely transformed into a visceral, unforgettable warning about the catastrophic consequences of unchecked greed and boundless ambition. The shocking news of Crassus's death sent reverberations across the ancient world, its impact extending far beyond the immediate military catastrophe. Word of the execution reached Rome within a mere few weeks, igniting a widespread panic among the ruling class. They suddenly grasped at the terrifying reality that their eastern frontier was far from secure, and that their adversaries possessed both the capability and the grim willingness to inflict humiliating defeats upon Roman arms. The carefully cultivated myth of Roman invincibility, meticulously nurtured through centuries of relentless expansion, had been utterly shattered in the unforgiving Mesopotamian desert. The political ramifications within Rome were immediate and profoundly severe. The triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for years was irrevocably broken, leaving Pompey and Caesar as formidable rivals rather than strategic partners. Without Crassus's immense wealth and influential presence to balance their fiercely competing ambitions, the two remaining strongmen initiated the cunning political maneuvering that would inevitably lead to a devastating civil war and ultimately the demise of the Roman Republic itself. In death, Crassus had inadvertently triggered the very conflicts he had so desperately sought to avert through his ill-fated eastern conquest. Parthian treatment of other Roman prisoners demonstrated clearly that Crassus's execution was not merely an act of sadistic cruelty, but a carefully calculated strategy to deter any future Roman aggression. Many surviving soldiers were strategically settled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they established new communities and gradually assimilated into the local populations. These former Romans served as living examples of Parthian mercy toward those who had not actively chosen war, contrasting sharply with the horrific fate of their commander who had initiated the conflict. The profound symbolic resonance of Crassus's death permeated throughout the ancient world, inspiring artists, writers, and philosophers for countless generations. The haunting image of molten gold being poured into the mouth of Rome's richest man became a powerful, enduring metaphor for the grave dangers of excessive materialism and unrestrained ambition. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, utilized the execution as a potent moral lesson about the corrupting influence of unchecked wealth and the inevitable, tragic consequences of hubris. Modern historians continue to meticulously debate the exact details of Crassus's death, with some questioning whether the molten gold story is literal truth or a symbolic representation of his fate. However, the broader historical significance remains unequivocally clear. The execution marked a pivotal turning point in Roman expansion eastward, and definitively demonstrated that the empire's enemies were capable of sophisticated psychological warfare that extended far beyond mere military tactics. The chilling manner of his death, whether precisely accurate or not in every detail, profoundly captured essential truths about the conflict's deeper meaning. The alleged fate of Crassus's remains became a calculated part of Parthian propaganda efforts, with his head purportedly sent to the court of King Orodes II, where it was shockingly used as a prop in theatrical performances that openly mocked Roman pretensions. Some historical accounts even suggest that Parthian actors utilized the severed head during performances of Euripides' classical play, Bacchae, with Crassus representing the tragic figure whose excessive ambitions led directly to his destruction. These dramatic theatrical presentations cleverly transformed a monumental Roman defeat into ongoing entertainment and a source of national pride for Parthian audiences. Archaeological evidence unearthed from the battlefield at Carrhae continues to yield invaluable insights into the devastating scope of the Roman disaster. Recovered weapons, fragments of armor, and scattered skeletal remains vividly paint a chilling picture of a complete military catastrophe. The artifacts silently narrate the story of a highly professional army that was systematically and utterly destroyed by enemies who possessed a deep understanding of both the tactical situation and the crucial psychological dimensions of warfare. Roman military manuals were painstakingly revised based on the bitter lessons learned from this crushing defeat. But the severe damage to imperial prestige could never be fully repaired. The profound legacy of Crassus's death significantly influenced Roman foreign policy for decades afterward, making subsequent emperors far more cautious about engaging in Eastern ventures and fostering a newfound respect for Parthian military capabilities. The disaster unequivocally demonstrated that Rome's enemies were not simply barbarian tribes to be easily conquered through superior discipline and engineering, but rather sophisticated civilizations possessing their own rich military traditions and astute strategic thinking. This crucial recognition marked the beginning of a more mature phase in Roman expansion, one that increasingly emphasized skilled diplomacy alongside raw military force. The tragic story of Marcus Crassus serves as a timeless, potent warning about the grave dangers of allowing personal ambition to completely override wisdom and sensible restraint. His dramatic transformation from a highly successful businessman to the architect of a military disaster vividly illustrates how individual character flaws can have catastrophic consequences that extend far beyond mere personal failure, profoundly affecting entire civilizations and irrevocably altering the very course of history. The molten gold that mercilessly ended his life remains a powerful and enduring symbol of how the very things we desire most intensely can ultimately become the instruments of our own destruction. In our modern world, where stark wealth inequality and relentless political ambition continue to profoundly shape global events, the death of Crassus offers sobering and timeless lessons about the complex relationship between power and responsibility. His story powerfully reminds us that true leadership demands far more than simply accumulating vast resources or achieving tactical victories. It fundamentally requires wisdom, genuine empathy, and a profound understanding of the broader consequences of our actions. The golden throat that silenced Rome's richest man continues to whisper warnings across the centuries about the exorbitant price of unchecked greed and the vital importance of knowing when truly enough is genuinely enough.